Welcome to the webinar GLP-1 Redesigning the Future of Food and Nutrition. My name is Deepesh Bista, analyst here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Urbi Pathak, analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in our question box on your screen. Permitting, we'll get back to your questions, and if your questions doesn't get answered, please do not hesitate to email us to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we will respond. If at any point you experience any technical difficulties like frozen screen, please simply refresh your browser and check your internet connection. And now let's jump onto the presentation. Over to you, Urbi.
Thank you so much, Dipesh, for the introduction. And thank you to all the attendees for joining us today in this webinar. I'm actually excited to see such strong interest from you in this topic that is rapidly changing how the industry is thinking about food and nutrition and working on it. Now, over the last 18 months, what we have seen, the GLP-1 adoption has started reshaping how consumers think about food, about hunger, about portion sizes, and even the role that food plays in their day-to-day lives. And in response, the food companies, the ingredient suppliers, or the retailers, they have all begun adapting, not in the same way, but quite in different ways, actually. Now, for decades, this food industry was optimized for the neurological reward system, right? So for cravability, for indulgence, for more engagement with food. But the GLP-1 and other incretin therapies are accelerating a very different consumer mindset now. So the consumers increasingly want smaller portions, higher satiety, metabolic stability, and more nutritional payoff per serving. So the same industry that optimized hyperpalatability is now trying to engineer a restraint. And that is the satiety paradox. As appetite compresses, every bite has to work really harder. Now, what's important is that the GLP-1 did not create a whole new brand market overnight. But what it really did was accelerate and connect different trends that were already emerging separately across retail, across food CPGs, functional nutrition. And that cascading effect is what has reshaped the industry response since around 2024. The first signals actually came from the retailers like the Walmarts and the Krogers, the Conagra brands. And what they started noticing is a measurable shift in the basket composition of the consumers. The spending behaviors changed. The consumers were buying fewer indulgent snacks, reducing their alcohol consumption purchases, and increasingly prioritizing products that they perceived as nutrient dense or high in protein. And that created a pressure upstream. Now, the food CPG companies responded instantly, but interestingly, most did not really reinvent their wheel. Instead, they repositioned what they already had in their portfolios, like high protein yogurts or nutrition shake, frozen meals, fiber rich snacks, especially for this emerging group of consumers. Now, as the food companies searched for more targeted solutions, ingredient players began repositioning and emphasizing the fibers, prebiotics, hydrolyzed proteins, different hydration blends, botanical compounds, and all the different metabolic health ingredients that they have around satiety, glycemic balance, digestive comfort, and muscle preservation. And this is where we started seeing a renewed investor interest in fibers and prebiotics, AI-enabled formulation platforms, and precision nutrition ecosystem entering the conversation. And together, these signals suggest something bigger than a short-term trend. So throughout this webinar, we broke down which technologies are actually aligned with consumers' key needs, that is before, during, and after the GLP-1 usage, and also for the metabolic health conscious consumers, for those who might not ever use the medications. We also try to separate the commercially durable opportunities from the categories that are still just in the lab stage or in the experimental stage. Going ahead, for the presentation today, we will look into the different consumers' unmet needs across the different consumer journeys. So we will then map those technology categories again, those needs of consumers, and assess where the innovation is most commercially viable. And finally, we will discuss what these means for the food industries, for the ingredient companies over the short term, mid term, and long term. One of the biggest mistake in the market right now is treating the entire GLP-1 consumers as a single segment, while in reality, the unmet needs differ significantly before the therapy, during the use of the drugs, and again, when you discontinue the drugs or you are on and off the drugs. So, taking a step back, our consumer insights team identified the key needs in these three groups. The broader metabolic health conscious consumers, that is in the first cohort, they are increasingly aware of managing their health and overall metabolic health through incremental steps in food and lifestyle. Now, the active users, they care more about their appetite regulation or their gastric comfort, preserving their muscle mass, hydration, sensory tolerance, and nutrient density within the smaller meal sizes that they take. Now, the post users, or those who are on and off the drugs, they increasingly focus on appetite regulation, satiety, and preventing that rebound behavior or the weight regain. Importantly, some of the most durable opportunities may exist outside the active GLP-1 use altogether. So many of these needs persist regardless of long-term drug adoption rates, actually. That brought us to these 10 technology clusters. So we identified these 10 recurring technology clusters appearing across developments within the industry. So right from the ingredient suppliers to the food companies, the direct-to-consumer platforms, different supplement brands, as well as digital health players. Now, some of these are already mature, commercially mature, and are physiologically very much grounded, while others are still largely narrative-driven. The key observation is that these technologies are not really competing equally. So some directly solve the nutritional and satiety-related problems, while others are mostly like to enhance the consumer experience or for more like personalization or consumer engagement. A lot of this activity has been emerging since around 2024, and that is across the entire food and beverage health value chain. But not all of these technology will solve the same level of consumer needs, right? So Lux built a scoring framework around two core questions. First, how strongly does each technology category align with the unmet consumer needs across the three different cohorts that we saw? And for that, across the y-axis, we evaluated across three different matrices that were the breadth of the unmet needs they addressed, the compatibility with nutrient-dense foods and meals, and thirdly, the contribution towards the organoleptics and the sensory experience, which is again a huge deal for the users, for the drug users. Now, this mattered because the technologies that improve satiety sometimes can fail on the taste, or the gastric tolerance, or the hydration, or even the formulation practically. So they are not likely to scale in a linear way across the reduced appetite environments. The second dimension is the x-axis, which looked at the innovation white space. And here we evaluated three different matrices, which is market saturation, the consumer consensus, and regulatory tailwinds. And this helped distinguish the categories that are already culturally understood among the consumers and commercially mature from categories that still require a lot of education or scientific validation or regulatory clarity. And as we plotted the 10 technology clusters, one pattern became very clear. the technologies that are directly tied to the core physiology of the users, especially around, say, protein systems or fibers or nutrient dense solutions, they consistently scored higher because they address multiple unmet needs of consumers while already fitting naturally into the existing food systems. In contrast, the categories which were positioned around terminologies like natural GLP-1 stimulation or personalized metabolic optimization, those often showed a larger innovation white space, but then also they also had a high uncertainty around scientific evidence or regulations or uncertainty in terms of long-term consumer adoption. Going more in depth, let's start with the enablers. So these enablers are actually the technologies or the tools that help in enhancing the taste, texture, hydration, and usability of the different GLP-1 aligned foods. Now, the enablers improve the experience around nutrient dense eating, but they are not yet the primary value proposition. Now, if you look within the technologies here, we have the flavor modulation, the hydration systems, the ingredient informatics. They are becoming increasingly relevant because the GLP-1 users often report side effects like nausea or taste distortion, sensory fatigue, and reduced excitement around food. And that is why a lot of flavor houses like IFFs and the Jivodams are now conducting consumer studies to understand where specifically can they focus on what actually it means by altered taste for different consumers who are using it. Another technology within this is the electrolytes, which are also being repositioned beyond sports hydration drinks now into more like wellness and medication support contexts, although their commercial ROI remains quite uncertain at this point. Now, the ingredient informatics and AI formulation tools are improving rapidly, but again, their GLP-1 specific optimization claims still remain highly experimental. And that brings us to a case study of the enablers. So let's look at this startup called Notco, which is a Chilean AI formulation platform. And this represents actually one of the more aggressive attempts to commercialize what they call the natural GLP-1 support. Now, Notco's AI designed botanical blend, it's positioned as a white label booster that can be integrated into existing food systems. What's notable here is it's not necessarily the formulation itself, but the shift towards a narrative-led innovation. The companies are, its clients are increasingly trying to position ingredients as appetite support or satiety support systems without really crossing into that pharma territory. However, the regulatory ambiguity and the growing consumer skepticism around these overstated claims or these functional claims make this category commercially fragile as of now. So many ingredient suppliers are now carefully avoiding direct use of languages like natural Ozempic or GLP-1 stimulator. And that takes us to the second category of technologies, which are the core physiology ones. Now, these technologies directly influence satiety, digestion, glycemic control, or they preserve the muscle mass. This is currently the strongest area of alignment between the consumer demands that we saw, as well as the formulation feasibility, the commercial scalability. Within these, we have the protein systems, different fiber, prebiotics, and these increasingly form the foundational stack of the GLP-1 support nutrition. Now, the active users of the drugs, they increasingly use more proteins in their day-to-day diets. They need around say 1.2 to 2 grams per kg of protein daily, which is around 30 grams per meal, to preserve their muscle mass while eating a smaller diet. And this is what most of the food CPG companies are increasingly targeting. Moreover, the conversation is shifting from rather protein quantity to more about protein quality. The ingredient suppliers at the same time are also positioning for systems like high leucine whey systems or beta lactoglobulin shots, slow digesting casinets, or different collagen blends, even protein prebiotic systems and targeted around, say, satiety or muscle preservation, metabolic support, and nutrient density. Now, some of the recent conferences or presses like VitaFoods Europe, which I attended, what I observed is that the emphasis of most of these companies that were out there in this space, their emphasis has shifted towards more like metabolic resilience and high impact nutrition. They no longer frame protein purely around, say, sports performance. So the market is kind of converging around the clinically familiar ingredients in formats that the consumers are very much familiar with. And one of the examples is Valio. So this is a good example of how incumbents are repositioning what they already had. In this case, dairy strength around metabolic resilience rather than entirely launching a new GLP-1 portfolio. Now, this Finnish dairy company, they expanded the use of their AILA lactose-free glycemic index ingredient range while positioning its milk protein concentrate around muscle recovery, muscle protein synthesis overnight due to its slow-releasing casein, along with claims of sensory optimization in a nutrient-dense formulation system. At the same time, it also expanded the distribution of its Profil brand into broader metabolic health positioning in international markets. The larger signal here is that the dairy protein industry is increasingly being framed or reframed around metabolic performance nutrition rather than just the sports nutrition that it initially had. Now, the third category of technology, which are the adjunct functionals. Now, these offer complementary benefits like appetite modulation, or they act as GLP-1 adjuncts. The technologies among these are like the botanical compounds or the probiotics or the postbiotics, novel metabolites and novel peptides. And they are generating substantial interest in terms of startup activity, but their commercialization remains quite uneven yet. Most of the activity today remains quite concentrated around, say, supplements rather than mainstream food integration. So if you look into botanicals, which are widely known like berberine for metabolic health, or bitter melon, cinnamon, different probiotics, postbiotics based support systems. Now, those are increasingly marketed around appetite control or metabolic wellness, but those are usually positioned as supporting layers rather than standalone solutions. So what we are seeing actually is really stacked functionality within familiar supplement or gummy-like formats. But on the regulatory side, their scrutiny is also increasing around ingredients that implies, say, GLP-1 mimicry or having drug-like evidence. Although there is not really a consensus around what GLP-1 support or GLP-1 friendly actually would mean, or how the consumer even understands these terms. One good example is the Israeli startup Lembas, which is developing this bioactive peptide that it claims triggers the production of GLP-1 and other gut hormones that regulate appetite and metabolism. Now, this reflects where a part of the market wants to go next, which is AI-based bioactive discovery peptides with pharmacological effects without really having the side effects of the drugs. Now, this particular company positions its peptide as an Ozempic competitor and initially plans the supplement commercialization before really entering the food and beverage market. However, despite strong investor interest in AI-designed peptides in general, the category, including Lembas, they remain quite in an early stage from a food industry perspective. So the human clinical validation or the regulatory frameworks, the consumer trust, those are still unresolved and would still require a long way to go. And moving ahead to the fourth category of digital health platforms, which comprises tools like continuous glucose monitoring, linked apps, the nutrition counseling platforms that provide personalized nutrition, or connected meal delivery platforms, um, the ones with behavioral feedback, or even remote monitoring for the drug users. Now, interestingly, the investments in this particular category has surged massively in this since around 2025, early 2025. We also saw last week the virtual nutrition counseling platform Nourish raising $100 million. However, their long-term consumer engagement remains quite uncertain. The personalized nutrition ecosystem, or rather the stratified nutrition, those only work if the consumers consistently remain engaged with their tracking systems or with their different behavioral platforms. Hence, the key challenge here is that the food decisions are still quite emotional, habitual, sensory, and not purely data driven yet. So, these platforms that rely heavily on continuous user usage, user input, and subsequent data, those might struggle with long term retention among the consumers. And one good example is Aura, the Aura rings. Now, why we brought up this case study is Aura actually illustrates how wearables are evolving from the regular recovery tracking into the broader metabolic health infrastructure. They also had a few recent acquisitions and very strong partnerships, actually, including Very and Dexcom. And those reflect a shift towards integrating meal timing, glucose context, sleep, stress, different behavioral analytics into a single ecosystem. Aura has recently also launched a meal tracking capability, but the broader challenge, if you look into their app, still remains unresolved across this entire category, that is digital platforms, and they still struggle to create what we would consider as a real or true personalized nutrition experience for consumers, so which can influence consumers' perceptions or their nutrition recommendations. So as a result, platforms like Aura, they currently function more as a behavioral awareness layer around metabolic health rather than directly solving what we would consider as the core nutritional or the satiety challenges. And hence, one of the clearest conclusions from this work is that companies should really avoid treating GLP-1 as a single trend wave. The strongest strategies will evolve with the consumer journey itself, right? In the near terms, what we see is the priority is really to reposition what you already have in terms of your current portfolios and structure them around nutrient density, satiety, metabolic health, while in the midterm, the companies will start to increasingly reformulate similar kind of categories using stacked functionality, sensory experience, and targeted nutrition systems. While over the longer term, we expect more integrated metabolic health ecosystems spanning across food ingredients, digital health, personalized nutrition. However, the winners are unlikely to be the companies making the loudest GLP-1 claims, but they will more likely to be the companies that quietly integrate metabolic relevance into everyday eating experience of the consumers. As we wrap up, what we understood is that GLP-1 may be the catalyst, but the opportunity is actually much, much broader. Across consumer segments, the direction is becoming increasingly clearer. So, more smaller portions, higher nutritional payoff per serving, a greater emphasis on these key unmet needs like satiety, renewed focus on protein quality, metabolic stability, gut health, gut stability. Secondly, the GLP-1 journey is not only about nutrition. It has to do a lot with behavioral changes, sensorial, emotional, and this entire new lifestyle of the consumers. So the brands that make consumers feel understood across this journey will likely build the most durable relevance. And finally, the outcomes matter more than explicit GLP-1 branding. In many cases, consumers are responding very strongly to concepts like sustained energy, fullness, nutrient density, muscle support, than to aggressive positioning around GLP-1 itself. So, with that, I thank everyone for joining us in today's webinar on redesigning the future of food and nutrition in the wake of GLP-1. And let's open the floor to questions.
Thanks, Urbi, for the great presentation. So now we'll be taking questions that you guys may have on the presentation, which you can always type on the question box. And if we don't get back to your questions on this call, we'll definitely reach out after the webinar and try to answer your questions. So there are a few questions popping in. Let me just try to rephrase the first one here. So Urbi, you mentioned about the Value case study, right, on its dairy product. So there's this question: is there indeed something significant going on in dairy industry while adapting to this space? So
Yeah, I think the dairy industry presents one of the clearest near-term opportunities, even when you look at the early adopters in the food CPGs like the Danones of the world. They actually started from dairy-based portfolios, right? And one major reason is that the global demand for advanced protein solutions, more whey proteins, more concentrates and isolates, that is actually accelerating beyond supply, which opens the door for a lot of the dairy companies. Um, you might have seen the recent development from this dairy leader Friesland Campina, who recently invested around 80, 90 million euros in their Dutch production facility. Now, that's one really big trend towards this. Another reason why I think dairy products really align with this entire GLP-1 ecosystem is how they naturally align with the requirements of the consumers, which is convenience, smaller portions, like spoonable yogurt or drinkable yogurt, or even the cottage cheese. Those are so easy to cook and prepare. Now, of course, they come with their own cons, like shorter shelf life than a lot of other protein sources, or formulation challenges due to the protein interactions with other ingredients in the system. So I definitely feel they would be the one of the first CPG companies who can really take a lead in this ecosystem. And that is what I also saw in a lot of the dairy companies that came up at the Vitafoods Europe this year, like Arla Foods, Friesland Campina.
let me just see. There is another question here. So this one's about, okay. So the question is more about, is it just a hype or what? So how much of the opportunity depends on long-term GLP-1 adoption? What if users slow down or if it's just a hype?
That's somewhat tricky. Some will argue that the GLP-1 adoption will be a plateau in the next 1 or 2 years, or that indulgence is too hardwired into the human culinary cultures to disappear. But I think this is a bigger trend than a temporary diet cycle, because most of the underlying behaviors of the consumers were already developing before this entire hype or whatever you call it started. So consumers were very much going after smaller or nutrient dense diets, high proteins, high fibers. So now if we look into where the industry is heading, both the drug and the food industry, so from some of the recent press releases or conferences that I attended, I saw GLP-1 is a lot of candidates are being tested at this point, around 100 to 150 drugs. Now, the reimbursement processes are also improving in the US, and that could trickle down to other countries as well. The oral formats, those are emerging. And the drug approvals are also widening across countries. At the same time, the research institutes, they are also viewing GLP-1 as a broader long-term metabolic health management system, right? So even I believe even if the adoption stabilizes eventually, we would still expect a lot of these trends or the food formulation uh, styles to still continue towards the metabolic health focused ecosystem. And like I mentioned, GLP-1 is a catalyst, but the I don't see consumers going back to fast food or heavy indulgence after what they have seen now.
That makes sense. I think we do have time for one more question. And okay, this one. Okay, this one. So it's about fiber. So you mentioned fiber repeatedly during this webinar. So are we actually seeing meaningful investment and innovation in fibers for GLP-1 related nutrition?
Yeah, definitely. I have seen a lot of startup activity in terms of investment and even a lot of formulations, reformulations within the industry leaders like the Dayton Lyles, Benio, ADM, Cargill. And what is common there is they are trying to reposition what they already have with a very few new innovation. Now, what we need to understand is some of the basic prebiotics and fibers like the inulins or the fructooligosaccharides, they are very well established in terms of an understanding of their metabolic benefits, health benefits. But then there are also a lot of other prebiotics and fibers that are coming up. Like they were there, but not as commercial as inulin and fructooligosaccharides, and a lot of other oligosaccharides like one bios. So this is what's trending. But then at the same time, you also have to understand that the real challenge is not really having more fibers, more prebiotics, but it's more like how you would formulate that in your food, which is the actual practical challenge. Because high fiber system can mean very different texture, viscosity, stability issues, texture, taste issues, or cost per unit, or the efficacy or the dosages. So these are real practical challenges that the food industry or the beverage industry is trying to solve.
Great. Urbi, there's few more questions here. If you don't mind, I'm gonna ask one last, depending on the time here. So let me just see. So we have this question. It's about we've seen all the demands of X or Y ingredient follow a trend to crash later. Example, fat, protein alternatives. Why is this cycle different for dairy? That's probably a follow-up on the dairy question that we got earlier. So
Yeah, dairy has this health halo, and I think for dairy it's very different because of the global community. They are very much attached, very much understand what dairy products are, the benefits, not just in terms of as a food, but also in terms of, say, as a beauty product on your skin. Now, that is the reason they find it safe. They want to stick to that, and it's quite established in terms of the proteins it has or the different safe fats that it has. And because of that, dairy has always been one of the leading industry in terms of food and beverage, and I believe it will continue to be so. Although a lot of other alternatives, like lactose free or plant based, but then again, plant based keeps on um, hiking or then going down. Yeah.
okay, I think we do. Let me just check the time. We do have time for one more question. So this one's
I
pretty
think so.
interesting.
Yeah.
So how the beauty industry is impacted by this? How skincare brands are like approaching the GLP-1 trend?
That's an interesting question. Um, for skincare, I believe the consumers' understanding or the shift in their entire lifestyle around the use of the drugs has made some of the beauty ingredients climb a bit more than others. And I believe one of the ingredient that we are seeing is definitely collagen. Um, Other interest has also been staying more hydrated, because with the GLP-1 you tend to eat less and then you tend to drink lesser, because unknowingly you also have an aversion towards water. So that also reduces your skin health, and that is why I think the bigger companies or the skin companies, cosmetic companies, are trying to have their messaging around staying more hydrated. There are other cosmetic compounds that are getting more popular. I would not say not necessarily due to GLP-1, but this entire awareness around food as medicine, or beauty from within. And because of that, a lot of peptides, hyaluronic acids on the skin, those are getting popular. But I what I can do is do a deep dive on if there are any specific compounds going into skincare, and then forward it to our client who has asked this question.
Okay, we can definitely do that, but we're
Yeah.
almost up with the time. So thanks again, Ruby, for a great presentation and answering all those questions. So that concludes our
Yep.
webinar for today. And the slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees via email. And after leaving the webinar, you guys will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. And we really appreciate your feedback that you have, so that we can improve our future webinars. Please take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars on our website as well. And thanks for joining us today, and have a great day.